welcome to the Rant Podcast. This is episode number 004. I'm your host, Nick Callahan. We got a whole lot going on this week, and you want to know what it is? Well, I'll tell you. We're going to talk a little bit about the first ever UN meeting, which was held as a meeting to speak against anti-Semitism. We're also going to talk a little bit about an arms embargo in South Sudan, as well as something that isn't based in hate and war and oppression. And let's go into a little something that is news that is quite literally out of this world. All that, little more. Rant Podcast, episode number 004. Coming right at you, baby. Rant Podcast. All right, and away we go. The UN has dedicated a separate meeting to anti-Semitism, citing a global rise in violence against Jews. About half of UN member states attended, with surprise speakers such as the Saudi ambassador, who equated anti-Semitic crimes with Islamophobia. French philosopher Bernard Henry Levy said in a keynote address to UN states on Friday, quote, "Faulting the Jews is once again becoming the rallying cry of a new order of assassins," end quote. He denounced what he called a radical inhumanity and a rising hatred towards Jews. U.S. Ambassador Samantha Power also spoke at the meeting, calling for nations to take a stand against what she called this monstrous global problem. She added that anti-Semitism was an increasing domestic concern in the U.S., as well as cited some shocking statistics from an FBI report, revealing that almost two-thirds of religion-based crimes in 2012 were committed against Jews. She said, quote, When human rights of Jews are repressed, the rights of other religious and ethnic groups are often not far behind, end quote. A seemingly unexpected speaker at the meeting was Saudi Arabia's ambassador Abdallah Malimi, who represented the 57-nation Organization of Islamic Cooperation. He stressed that Islamic countries denounce all actions that lead to hatred or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Malimi also stated that anti-Semitic crimes and Islamophobia have many similarities in their essence. He said, "We have witnessed with growing concern in the increase in hate crimes around the world, and we are very concerned because some arbitrarily reject their responsibilities in this regard. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and all crimes that are based on religious hate are inextricably linked. They're inseparable," end quote. He pointed to a close connection between the increase in hate crimes, extremism, and violence, and anti-Semitism, and Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory, political crisis, economic recession, and policies that benefit only the powerful players. Malimi concluded that a dialogue would be the most effective step toward resolving these issues. Levy, meanwhile, asked the attending UN members for new ways to argue against anti-Semites, including whose call Israel an illegitimate state and deny the Holocaust. He said, "It is up to you, who are the faces of the world, to be the architects of a house in which the mother of all hates would see its place reduced. May you in a year's time and in years after that and every other year reconvene to observe that the mobilization of today was not in vain," end quote. The meeting was of an informal nature, with only half of the 193 member states in attendance. Assembly spokesman John Victor Nicolo confirmed to the Associated Press that despite discussing the topic of anti-Semitism during other UN sessions, it was the first time the whole meeting was dedicated to the issue. 37 UN members have requested the session by sending a letter to the Assembly President, Sam Kutesa, on October 1st. The nations demanded a response to an alarming outbreak of anti-Semitism worldwide. Incidentally, the meeting came in the wake of the deadly Charlie Hebdo terror attacks in France, which included a hostage situation in a Paris kosher store. Gunman Amity Koulibaly, who claimed he swore allegiance to Islamic State and was acting in retaliation for attacks on Muslims in the Middle East, killed 4 French Jewish hostages at the store before he was gunned down by police. But anti-Semitic crimes first surged earlier this past summer after Israel began its 50-day war in Gaza. The conflict took the lives of over 2,000 people. The vast majority of them were Palestinians and drew heavy international criticism. Attacks in Europe ranged from physical assaults, firebombing of synagogues, and calls for violence against Israelis. The Jewish population in Germany even resorted to placing armed guards at its doorsteps ahead of Yom Kippur, celebrations back in the fall, according to media reports. Other deadly attacks, including shootings at the Belgian Jewish Museum, where at least 3 people did die, and the Jewish school in southwestern France, where a teacher and 3 children were also killed. What I raise on that issue is not just to the UN or the US, it's to people all around the world, whether they're in government or not. Just people. Just speaking to the people. People have been here and evolving on this planet for roughly 100 million years. We have evolved over the past 100 years more than anyone ever could have imagined. We have managed to put satellites into space that can literally read your license plate on the back of your car from orbiting the Earth, which is an amazing technological advancement that was brought by physicists and engineers and people of mass genius. But as a collective people, we still haven't figured out that the only race that really matters is the human race. When more people can finally buckle down on that idea, then we could start really moving forward in a positive direction as a collective race. Because black doesn't matter, white doesn't matter, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, doesn't really matter if you could just break it down to people helping people. Somewhere along the line we just got dumbed down and we stopped evolving. And this is something that has to change. We have to take back our intellect. We have to take back our moral compass. Doesn't seem to be what they think right now in South Sudan, where we're going to talk a little bit about an arms embargo. And in South Sudan, all the while top U.S. diplomats have privately backed a weapons ban. And this is where U.S. officials tussle over an arms embargo and sanctions in the oil-rich South Sudan. While top U.S. diplomats have privately backed a weapons ban amid the bloody civil war in South Sudan, a new report indicated that U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice is chiefly responsible for stalled attempts at an arms embargo in that oil-flush nation. In a story titled Mediating Mass Murder, which was brought to you in Foreign Policy magazine, reported Monday that Rice, U.S. President Barack Obama's top national security policy advisor, has resisted support from U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power for an arms embargo to buttress possible economic sanctions and other punitive measures that would encourage an end to the 13-month-long conflict that has killed tens of thousands of people and displaced millions more. One United Nations Security Council diplomat told Foreign Policy magazine that an arms embargo is being blocked by the White House National Security Council. One of those diplomats did go on record, but did request to be kept anonymous. That quote was that both Power and Kerry are much more open to sanctions, possibly even including an arms embargo, than the NSC is. We have the sense here in New York that they wanted to move forward, but they were hampered by Washington, end quote. Last month, Kerry and Rice wrote in the Washington Post that a peace deal must come soon, yet the pair offered little in the way of specific actions the U.S. was considering. The quote was that after months of delay and false pledges, both sides must return to negotiations and make necessary compromises and finally end this conflict without further delay. In South Sudan, fighting between the warring sides led by President Salva Kiir and his former Vice President Riek Machar, has left at least 50,000 people dead, and it's displaced millions and millions more. The fledgling nation created in 2011 has shown no signs of reconciliation as ethnic, religious, and economic power struggles remain intact. The UN action on that is that the United States, which encouraged South Sudan's split from neighboring Sudan, has sent billions to the South Sudanese government and is said to be in the best position to push for UN Security Council sanctions. Yet sanctioning efforts have not materialized despite repeated threats from several top U.S. officials since December of 2013 when the conflict officially began. Earlier this month, the U.S. sent a draft resolution to the UN Security Council. Other national representatives like Britain, China, France, and Russia that indicated an asset freeze and travel ban on top government and rebel leaders blamed for the ongoing violence and for slowing attempts at a peace deal. The resolution introduced the prospect of an arms embargo in the future, yet the draft does not offer any solid reference of an arms ban. Two diplomatic sources said that any embargo in a subsequent resolution would not happen until March or April, at the earliest. A Security Council diplomat also added that that would be at the end of South Sudan's traditional fighting season. It's unclear if either Russia or China would support any embargo efforts, though those nations have indicated, according to Foreign Policy magazine, that they would prefer that African nations decide on any sanctions against the two sides. An arms ban would help to halt the supply of weapons to individuals and groups who have committed serious violations of human rights, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and protect civilians at grave risk. In complicating matters, Princeton Lyman, the special U.S. envoy for Sudan and South Sudan from 2011 to 2013, told the U.S. in December that Susan Rice is, quote, sympathetic and very, very close to the South Sudan government. Rice has also been criticized for her ties to Salva Kiir, the president of South Sudan. Kiir helped found the Sudan's People Liberation Army, or SPLA, which fought in Sudan's decade-long civil wars and was instrumental in fomenting an eventual split from Sudan. Rice developed ties to the SPLA as a national security official in the Bill Clinton administration of the 1990s. While out of public service, she kept up those ties, while George Bush and his administration also became a close ally of Kiir in the creation of South Sudan. Rice was the NSC's director for international organizations and peacekeeping from 93 to 95 and was also a special assistant to the president and senior director for African affairs from 95 to 97, meaning she played a major role in how the Clinton administration addressed genocide in Rwanda. She is known for advocating against the White House labeling the events in Rwanda as genocide and to not militarily intervene, which is moves that she said she came to later regret. She was also known to be a close ally of ruthless former Ethiopian dictator Meles Zenawi, whom she eulogized at his funeral in 2012. Now, in April, the U.S. did impose economic sanctions on some South Sudan officials allegedly related to ongoing atrocities. Donald Booth, the current U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan, said, quote, "We're working now in support of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, talking about a sanctions resolution in the UN that would mirror what we have done bilaterally already," end quote. U.S. officials have publicly put impetus on African-led actions to encourage peace. Now, the elephant in the room is obviously the oil. South Sudan's deep untapped oil reserves. Before the conflict began, South Sudan produced about 220,000 to 240,000 barrels of oil per day, with around two-thirds going to China. The Washington Post reported those figures 1 year ago. China has invested billions in developing oil in South Sudan. Yet, fighting has curbed operations and forced evacuations of many Chinese oil workers, echoing the nation's oil efforts in Libya. China's oil-producing operations there have not rebounded from the overthrow of Gaddafi's government led by Western powers. The opposition hopes that by capturing the oil fields, they'll gain the upper hand in ceasefire negotiations by halting the government's main source of income. Oil is the prize at the end of this conflict. You have a piece of land who's rich in this resource, but we still have tens of thousands of people being killed in the name of oil. American oil companies have found it difficult to compete amid the conflict, and while other nations like China have dominated the petroleum landscape. For instance, in April, the ExxonMobil Corporation, which is the largest American oil company, pulled out of oil exploration in South Sudan. Casey Copeland, who is a South Sudan analyst with the International Crisis Group, told Bloomberg that with Exxon pulling out, South Sudan's economic lifeline will continue to be non-Western oil companies, leaving Western diplomats with little economic leverage with the country and faltering peace talks. End quote. The aims of America's actions, including a wait-and-see type of attitude about the ongoing slaughter, are fairly explicit, which many people have argued. Writing in Counterpunch, Tommy C. Mountain called South Sudan the only majority Chinese-owned oil field in Africa. And thus, the U.S. has clear reasons for exasperating chaos through proxies in the region or by any other means necessary. Ethiopia, in particular, has supplied weapons to Riek Machar's fighters with an eye on the national oil supply of South Sudan. So again, we see more oil war. War is obviously the most profitable industry on the planet. Next thing in line at number 2 would be oil. So the two most profitable industries in the planet are also causing massive amounts of death in certain regions of the world. Now, Americans, don't let this fool you. Just because this isn't in your backyard doesn't mean that it is to be ignored and you could just brush it under the rug. Start looking around and start ignoring color and ethnicity and look at people as people. Look at the race only as the human race. People need to stand up and take action. It's speaking out. Words can be your best weapon. And compared to what the military-industrial complex can come up with to fight against you, words might be your only weapon. They've gotten things so far downhill that it's even affected water supplies. Last week we talked about taxation on water supplies in Ireland and how people rose up and spoke against that. That's people using their freedom of speech and free will to try and gain a positive outcome from a negative situation. And if you don't believe me that the water supply is killing people, listen to this crazy little story about a boy in Louisiana. Researchers have discovered the first confirmed case of someone contracting a deadly brain-eating amoeba known as Naegleria fowleri through that tap water. Prior victims were infected after swimming in warm bodies of fresh water. A study published this month in the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases reported that a 5-year-old Louisiana boy did, in fact, pick up the microorganism from tap water, possibly via a slip and slide or a public pool. About 2 weeks later, he perished from an infection known as primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, or PAM. Naegleria fowleri is called the brain-eating amoeba because it can digest neural tissues. Upon entering the body via the nasal passages, Naegleria fowleri penetrates bone between the sinuses and the brain to form an infection, breaking down nerve cells in the process. Ensuing swelling of the brain occurs, ushering in PAM, which is usually fatal. PAM kills up to 8 people per year in the U.S., usually males with a median age of 12. The Louisiana boy was taken to a hospital in July of 2013 after he acquired a 104-degree fever and complained of a devastating headache, in addition to bouts of vomiting. Doctors later recorded 2 short staring episodes, in which the boy would gaze straight ahead for a few seconds without responding. The infection, though, could not be identified or halted after several tests and antibiotics. The boy eventually developed seizures and was declared brain dead. His family did take him off life support 5 days after he entered that New Orleans hospital. His was the first confirmed case to have been triggered by tap or faucet water and not freshwater immersion. Other cases have been the result of drinking water contaminated via a body of fresh water, such as other cases in Louisiana that have pointed to Hurricane Katrina's effect on the water supply system. Neti pots or nasal rinses have been associated with the microorganism as well, such as one case that was in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Louisiana has recently increased efforts to test for the amoeba while advising higher levels of chlorine in its water treatment operations. The CDC has an emergency drug called maltepacine to combat PAM cases, though it's not commercially available. This is it's a free-living amoeba that doesn't have to infect anybody. It's perfectly happy feeding on bacteria. What we want to find out is why in some people it's so pathogenic and deadly and what makes it that way. And obviously it has to be looked at. Again, we went back to the median age in all those cases that did result in death. That median age was 12 years old. So we need to figure out why also in that median age it can be so pathogenic. And I know that that's kind of sad. Why do we have children literally dying from tap water and so-called fresh water? So we're now going to give you a little bit of news that is a little bit on the upside and a little bit out of this world. Well, you know how Saturn, the planet in our solar system, has those big old rings around it? Well, you think those are big? Well, they're not even close. Check this out. When the University of Rochester's Eric Mamajic tells the astronomers that he's hanging around with about the object that he and his colleagues discovered about 430 light years from Earth, they were pretty skeptical, and it's no wonder why, because what he has found is a giant ring system, which is sort of like Saturn's, but it's some 200 times roughly bigger, circling what may be an exoplanet between 10 and 40 times the size of Jupiter. If you put these rings in our solar system, they'd stretch all the way from Earth to the Sun, which is a distance of approximately 93 million miles. And what's more, there's evidence that the rings are sculpted by at least one exomoon, something that also happens at Saturn, but not remotely on this scale, much, much larger. Eric said it took him and his colleagues a year to convince even themselves what they were seeing. At the time, the observations seemed to make no sense. When a planet passes in front of a star, you usually see a dip in starlight that lasts for up to a few hours. And in this case, that starlight dimmed for roughly 2 months. And it wasn't a steady dip either. The star would fade, then brighten, then fade again. And it was in a way that it made no sense at all. And when Mamajic and his group stumbled on the data in 2010, he said that he took a printout of the light curve, put it on the wall, and stared at it for a week. And as crazy as it seemed, the most plausible explanation was a giant ring system with gaps like Saturn's that let more or less light through at different times during the passage. It's the same indirect way that the rings of Uranus were discovered in 1997. The planet itself doesn't show up in the observations, but that could be explained if the ring system is slightly off-center as it moves in front of the star. The star, though, which the new planet orbits, is thought to be very young, as far as it's young in the terms of astrophysics, but it's about 16 million years old. And we say that that's young because we're looking at roughly 13.7 billion years. So 16 million years is fairly young compared with our own solar system's 4.6 billion years. If the scientists are right about what they're seeing, the mammoth ring system will get smaller over time as the outer bands condense into moons. So moons will form out of those outer bands as they spin at rapid speeds. That's what you see in our solar system. You have rings tucked in close to the planets and moons further out. So presumably we're seeing the intermediate step with that ring system. It all seems familiar except for the ring system's size, which is absolutely unprecedented, and which is the reason other astronomers are waiting to be convinced. I agree with the authors that it's appropriate to consider an interpretation based on rings. The idea that the outer parts would condense into moons relatively quickly, however, means that we're seeing the rings at their full extent during a very narrow window of existence. The sort of coincidence that scientists really don't like to see. Whenever your explanation involves catching something during a phase that won't last very long, it's a little concerning. Much of the doubt could be erased if astronomers could see the rings pass by again on another orbit around the star. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. They've got only the single passage, which was back in 2007, meaning the exoplanet is on a relatively long orbit. We think, as of now, given the data that Kenworthy and Mamjek were able to produce, that could last at least up to 10 or 15 years. They don't know for sure, though, and since it's tough to keep big telescopes aimed at this one star hoping for another passage, the astronomers have recruited members of the high-end amateur group, the American Association of Variable Star Observers, to monitor the situation. They're also going back through digitized versions of old images from observatories around the world, looking for evidence of other stars that faded mysteriously for a while without explanation. They might, that is, if they're really seeing rings, they went on record and said that now that we know what we're looking for, we might find that there are a lot of them out there. So it sounds like they're going to keep looking, and that's just a fascinating topic, so I wanted to end it on a little bit more of an out-of-this-world kind of note. So, as always, I'm your host, Nick Callahan. Thank you so much for listening to the Rant Podcast. Be sure to tune in to us next week, Wednesday, same time, same day. Rant Podcast will be coming at you, episode number 005 in just 1 week. So don't go nowhere, baby. Come on back and hang with us again. We surely do appreciate it. Signing off, Rant Podcast, Nick Callahan. Arrivederci.